Mr. Ellis, thank you so very much for your generous introduction. Leaders and administrators and members of the SBA, our celebrated Leacock family, our honored sponsors, good evening, everyone. It is always for me an honor to be back at the KFIL campus, a place I used to know well, and to be in the company of small business colleagues and participants in this effort at economic democracy. I could not refuse the invitation simply because, for me, it's an act of political solidarity to be with the SBA. It is also important to celebrate the legacy of a man who I admired and respected, Mr. Leacock. We spent 8 hours on a flight from London to Barbados once. It was one of the most educational journeys of my life, and we miss him. And also to say something about the political narrative as it relates to the development of small businesses in Barbados. Political solidarity in the sense that it has been for me a very long conversation. I remember in the build-up to the 1986 election in Barbados, Mr. Barrow called and asked if I could meet with him, and I did. And he said he was a bit jaded with the old political language, the language of secondary education, the language of social mobility, which was a part of his vision. But he wanted a new language. And I wrote for him a small document entitled Economic Democracy in Barbados, in which the moment of economic enfranchisement of the majority of people on the island was, for me, the paramount conversation in Barbados. I wrote a paper that became the manifesto statement of the DLP, Economic Enfranchisement for the Black Community. That was used in 1986, 1991. In 1994, after Mr. Arthur became our Prime Minister, in conversation, he said to me, well, how can you assist my government outside of the university context? And in that conversation, I agreed to serve as director of the micro enterprise, the Fund Access. And I served with the Fund Access for 5 years, because for me, again, that was the most important issue for me in that election: how are working class black people going to participate in this economy? So for me, it has been a long time, and as you all know, in the 80s, we had to raise a bit of hell in Barbados in order to deal with the mutual and other matters in respect of the economic rights of the black community. So this, for me, then, is not an academic lecture. I'm not sure if I'm wearing Vice Chancellor's hat or not, but for me, this is a highly political matter. It's the most important developmental issue in this country at this time, and remains so, and will remain so for many years to come until something is done about it. Now, we all have read the very extensive literature on small businesses and the development of market economies. This literature is extensive. It is disciplinary, produced by historians, economists, statisticians, and we all have looked at this literature very closely, and we have all come to the conclusion, yes, as we heard, small businesses are critical to the performance of any economy. Small businesses in most market economies do employ the majority of citizens. Small businesses are the site of innovation and incubators for some of the greatest ideas that have moved market economies along. And all of that is true. And we all know that economists at this moment are formulating very interesting theoretical positions on how economies that are dominated by big business are indeed inefficient economies. Listen closely to the Obama conversation, and the economists who surround him, they are formulating this view that all economies dominated by large business are underperforming economies and in the end do not become competitive. The stimulus to capitalist economies, the engine room, invariably the small and medium business sector. Just 2 weeks ago, a student in Jamaica at the Mona campus came to me to discuss a thesis possibility. And I said to her that what you ought to do is to do a doctorate dissertation on how the financial sector is related to small businesses in the Jamaican economy. And we all know the language. We've listened to small businesses complaining about the inability of the commercial sector to take risks to support them. And in many instances right now, there's a language that says they are being squeezed by large financial institutions that are not committed in their policy framework to risk in respect to small businesses. We know the environment very well. But I do not wish to disguise my analysis in the context of any ephemeral or generic concept about small businesses. What we are talking about is black businesses in this country. We know that, yes, we should not scientifically conflate small businesses and black businesses, but in the context of our society, that conflation is possible. The majority of our small businesses in this country historically have been black businesses. So we are going to speak in the context of ethnic relations to capital and market economies and the journey of the black people through the economy of Barbados. Many of our distinguished Caribbean economists have looked at this through historical eyes. It is no longer fashionable for economists to historicize. Economists as a whole in this generation are focusing almost entirely on the present reality without historical reflection. But our finest economists have always reflected. Our Nobel laureate, Sir Arthur Lewis, was a fine economist precisely because he historicized the Caribbean economy from the very inception to the present moment. Lloyd Best, Norman Girvan, Havelock Brewster, all of these brilliant economists in the Caribbean have picked up the historical context, journeyed from the past to explain why it is that our economies are structured the way they are. Economies are not acts of God. Economies are created by historical processes, they are legislated by governments, and they evolve over time. I'm very pleased to read an article by one of my younger colleagues, Jonathan Lashley of Salesius, wrote a remarkable piece 10 years ago on small micro businesses in Barbados, the issues before us. It was really an essay, unusual for a young economist to historicize, but he did. And his thesis is clear. We need to understand the environment that has been created within which small businesses operate. We need to understand historical legacies that shape the environment within small businesses operate. We need to look at the historical reasons why black entrepreneurship has not flourished and does not flourish, and the forces that operate within the economy to inhibit the efficient development of black businesses. And I support this. In fact, what I'm going to do in this presentation is to present the historical dimension of Mr. Lashley's analysis. And this is exactly what we wish to do, which is to historicize what we now call the Barbados model. Barbados economy as we know it today was made by legislation. It was historically rooted in very specific framing legislative instruction and direction. It was framed and created in the context of white supremacy and monopoly domination of a minority of the community. There were winners, there were losers. This is how the economy was structured. We had all hoped that with independence there would have been structural change, structural transformation, and we had all hoped that an economic democracy would have evolved in our economy commensurate and consistent with the political democracy we have created. This has not been the case. What I wish to speak then to is the history of this system of ownership, a system of distribution which exists in our country, the ideology of participation, which is very important, who should participate and who should not participate, and the role of government in enforcing these systems. Let us look at the background to all of this. We know that Barbados was the first black slave society in the world. Prior to the establishment of the slave economy in Barbados, there had been slavery in many other parts of the world. But on the first occasion that enslaved Africans became the majority in any economy, the first occasion that an entire economic system was built on enslaved labor was Barbados. And all of us in the historical community, we have all examined why this has been the case. And we have developed a substantial literature that look at the uniqueness of Barbados. In the context of this hemisphere, Barbados was the first society with a black majority in the hemisphere. By 1655, the majority of people on this island were Africans. No other colony in the hemisphere had a black majority. The significance of that is important because Barbados then becomes the first society to legislate what it is to run a black economy, a black slave economy. The first legislation, 1636. Any African person brought to the island of Barbados shall be received as their chattel, there and their offspring. 1661. The first slave laws ever created in the hemisphere, the Barbados laws of 1661, became the template for all other colonies. Jamaica subsequently, South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New England all adopted the Barbados Code of 1661. 1668, the black people on the island of Barbados are classified not only as property, but they are classified in law as real estate. That is, they were attached to the properties and could be bought and sold with the properties. The historians have argued that Barbados became the most racially oppressive society in the world because there had been no other society like this ever in the history of humanity. It became the first society in which black people were not only classified as property, but were prohibited in law from owning property. This system has very interesting roots. So what we're going to speak about now, and I will show you some of this, is how it came to be that economic life was legislated as exclusively a white domain. This is the first act that was passed by the Barbados Assembly, 1694, an act to prevent the sale of goods to Negroes. Africans were not allowed to participate in transactions. On the penalty of imprisonment, a white person could be sent to jail for selling goods to Negroes. Secondly, an act to prevent the employment of Negroes in selling. African peoples were not allowed to be employed in any commercial activity under law. And bear in mind that the Africans have arrived on this island with highly developed commercial cultures. They are coming out of West Africa, where commerce was part of the culture, going to the market, buying, selling, long-distance trade. The Ghanaians and Nigerians were selling across the Sahara into Egypt. They were going across the Indian Ocean, selling to India and China. And the black people, therefore, arrived in Barbados with a highly developed commercial culture of short and long-distance trade. Trading, buying, and selling were therefore intrinsic to African culture and civilization, and this is what they brought to Barbados. The reason why these acts were passed by the Assembly of Barbados was precisely to contain, to suppress, and to eradicate this commercial impulse among the black community. 1708, an act to prohibit the inhabitants of this island from employing Negroes and other slaves in buying and bartering. Again, what we're speaking about here is despite the legislation, despite the punishments and the whipping and the brutality, the black people are persisting, driving the assembly to upgrade its legislation and to insist upon commercial life and commercial culture as a white monopoly. The reason why Parliament is legislating decade after decade is because of the resistance to this attempt to eradicate their culture. 1733, no Negro shall be allowed to plant crops and expose the same for sale. Any Negro who shall be found with any such or exposing the same for sale, such goods shall be deemed as stolen goods. This is the beginning of the association of black business with theft and illegality. So any commodity which any African was seen buying, selling, or exchanging in Barbados, the magistrates were given authority to confiscate those properties under law because all such goods were deemed as stolen goods. So thus we get the beginning of this formulation where black business and black activity in the commercial space is associated with criminality and theft. And these images have survived. And it's always important to look at how legacies have survived over generations. Still is hanging over the heads of the black community a perception that they are associated with theft in the commercial activity. 1749, it shall be illegal for any Negro to assemble together at huckster stores, either to buy, sell, or congregate. In other words, not only must you not practice, you must not even be in the space. You must not be allowed in the space where business is being transacted. And this is the Barbados government persistently framing the legal structure to exclude the majority people on this island. 1774, this is now almost 100 years later, an act to prohibit goods and wares and other merchandise and other things being carried from house to house or about the streets and roads to be bought, sold, bartered by Negroes, and to prevent commercial huckstering of Negroes. Again, we're speaking now of a century of legislation on the island, driving into the black community an impulse to consume and not to transact. This act was amended, and the amendment is particularly important in our context. All Negroes given permission to buy and sell, not on their own account, that is, they could buy and sell for other people, but such as their owners, but they shall wear a metal collar about the neck. The owner of the said slave shall be engraven upon the said collar, and the maker of the collar likewise. So if a white person gives permission to an African to transact business on his or her behalf, and in some instances this had to be the case because the owner of that African might be ill, might be infirm, and might require the African to transact on their behalf. The law specified that such persons had to wear this metal collar. And the metal collar around the neck would carry the name of the owner and the person who made the collar. So now what you see is the imagery of the imprisonment of the body of the African in the commercial space. So that if you saw an African in Bridgetown transacting business, wearing a collar around the neck, you see the association between the imprisonment of the body and the legislation as imagined by the Barbados Assembly. And then finally we have in 1811, the Court of the Grand Session. And I want you to bear in mind that we're now into 150 years of legislation by the Barbados government. A white-dominated government that specifies the role of legislation to frame the economy, to decide who should participate, and to use the laws in order to create a culture of commerce. But there is constant resistance because the impulse from the African community here is very strong. The impulse is constantly growing. And now the Grand Sessions of the court have asked that a prison be erected on the Roebuck. This is Roebuck Street. And a prison was built there for the arrest and detention of all Negroes found buying and selling in Bridgetown. Magistrates started to arrange for the flogging of such Negroes and the securing of their detention. A special category of police were called jumpers. And jumpers were paid by the local government to flog these Negroes who were arrested for buying and selling in Bridgetown. And a cage, or a prison it was called, a cage was built for the detention of these persons. Now, you will want to ask the question, why is it that despite this brutality, despite the persistence of the government, the majority community demanded their right to be an economy? Let us look towards the end of slavery and establish the symbolism of all of this. Towards the end of slavery, London Bourne is one of the richest merchants in Bridgetown. He's a black man who came through a slavery experience but found his freedom, and through phenomenal acts of risk-taking became extremely wealthy. This was during the years of the Napoleon Wars and the years of the Anglo-American War. And established merchants were not prepared to send their ships across the Caribbean Sea to move cargo from island to island. London Bourne bought a schooner and took his risk, sent his schooners across the Caribbean Sea in the midst of war, and charged wartime rates, obviously, and did well. And he bought one ship, he bought two, he bought three, and eventually he emerged as one of the richest men in the city. But if you know a building which was there on Bay Street, it used to be called the Old Exchange. It was demolished. The Old Exchange that was demolished about 10 years ago, that was London Bourne's building. He built that building in the early 19th century. But the remarkable thing about the building was that the Bridgetown Merchant House, that the white merchants of Bridgetown transacted the exchange on the top floor of that building. So the established merchants of Bridgetown rented from London Bourne the top floor of that structure. And this is where they conducted their commerce. It was called Commercial House. But he was a landlord and lived downstairs, and he could not go upstairs. They brought the rent to him downstairs, but he could not go upstairs, and he was one of the richest merchants in the city. And he became a symbol of the economic apartheid that was created by the Barbados government over 200 years in this country. It's important to understand how government would go about framing all of this. And as I've said, economies are not acts of God. They're not acts of nature. Economies are created by ideas, by governments. They frame it. And the structuring of an economy is dependent on the ideas which are articulated in the society about who should participate, who should not. So in every economy, there is a dominant set of ideas. Now, John Poyer was the leading white intellectual in Barbados in the early 19th century. John Poyer was a Spikestone man, he was a merchant, he was also a highly educated man, and he became the leading thinker about society in Barbados at the end of slavery. And this statement here from John Poyer sets out precisely why the government of Barbados had organized the economy in this way. And this is the famous statement by John Poyer in which he sets out the apartheid that operates within the economy of Barbados. And he says, in every well-constituted society, a state of subordination necessarily arises from the nature of civil government. Interesting. Without this, no political union can long subsist. To maintain this fundamental principle, it becomes absolutely necessary to preserve the distinctions which naturally exist resulting from the nature of our society. First, between the white community and the colored people, that is the brown-skinned mulatto people. That's the first distinction. And the second distinction between what he called the whites and the Africans, the master and the slaves. Nature, he says, and this is not government, nature has strongly defined these differences, not only in the complexion of the people, but in the mental, intellectual, and corporal faculties of the different species, the three different species of people, white people, the brown people, the black people. He called them species. Our colonial codes have acknowledged and adopted these distinctions. In other words, he is a spokesman for the government. He is the articulator of this structure. This becomes the Barbados model, and he theorizes the reasons for this model. 3 different species with 3 different intellectual capabilities, and the government, that is the colonial laws, the colonial codes, the government has adopted these distinctions in framing the economy. The Barbados model then became a template for other colonies in the Americas. You might not be aware, and I hope that when you were watching the mayhem in South Carolina a few weeks ago, the massacre of folks in the church, and the refusal of the ruling class to remove the Confederate flag, that this was personal to all Barbadians, because South Carolina was a Barbadian society. South Carolina was built by the white Barbadians. It was a colony of Barbados. South Carolina was given to the Barbadians by King Charles II. They wanted room to expand, and the king gave them South Carolina. It was a project which was financed by John Colleton, a well-known St. John planter here on the island, vestryman for St. John, Yeamans, John Millerton. 3 of the wealthiest slave owners in Barbados took possession of South Carolina and became its first governors. They took the 1661 law, the code, and they passed it in the South Carolina Assembly almost word for word, and they framed South Carolina as a surrogate of Barbados. It's not surprising, therefore, that Barbados became the last colony in the British Empire to pass the Emancipation Act. The British government passed the act. All the colonies were instructed to acknowledge the Emancipation Act in their assembly. Of the 18 British colonies, Barbados was the last to pass the act. And they passed it only because the British government threatened them to pass it. The Barbados Assembly said, "We will not undo that which we have done. We will not destroy a perfectly well-constituted society." And they refused to do so. They had to be forced to do so. South Carolina becomes the first colony in America to fire the guns to defend slavery. The first battle to defend slavery in the context of Abraham Lincoln was South Carolina, the one colony that said, "We will not give up slavery." So the connection between Barbados and South Carolina to this very day remains the same. I remember going to a government conference in Charleston some years ago, and was located in one of the fanciest hotels in South Carolina. And that property was owned by the Middleton family after 200 years. The same Middleton family of Barbados had survived through 200 years in one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. And the hotel was owned by them. And I got to this hotel with government escorts. And I'm emphasizing this because I want you to know that normally I could not afford to stay in a hotel like that. But I am there because I'm a guest of the government. And I go to this place. And the valet takes my bags and takes me to the room. And when he got there, he said, "I have been working here for 35 years, and you're the first black person I have ever seen brought to this hotel." It was really quite remarkable. But South Carolina is the frozen Barbados, and the relationships remain the same. And I think we need to take ownership of all of that. So let us go forward then. Let us go forward. Let's look at the moment of emancipation and what happens to the Barbados economy. The British government decided to end slavery. No longer required, no longer needed, now an embarrassment. The British economy is now self-sustaining, it's wealthy, it's moving. It no longer needs to extract wealth from black people. And so it decides to bring an end to the formal aspect of slavery, which is the legal aspect. There are 800,000 Africans in the British Empire. 800,000 enslaved Africans in the British Empire. The British government placed a value on them at £47 million. That's about 21 billion pounds in today's money. About 21 billion pounds in today's money. But 47 million pounds was the value. The British government decided that since these people are property, we have to compensate the owners of this property. So we have to give them property compensation. But the only way the government can pass the legislation and impose compensation was, first of all, for the British government to deem that all black people are property, and since all black folks are property, we have to pay property compensation. And so they said, but we're not going to pay 47 million. We're going to compensate them 20 million. Now, the British government is going to pay compensation of 20 million, but the black folks are valued at 47 million. The British government passed an act of emancipation in which the 27 million margin had to be made up by the enslaved people themselves. So the Emancipation Act says we will pay 20 million to the slave owners, but the slave owners shall have access to the black labor for 8 additional years at no cost. They called it the apprenticeship system, where the blacks were asked to work for free for another 8 years to work off the 27 deficit between the value and what the British government was paying. All of this meant that at emancipation, the impetus of free black people to go into business was again put on the back burners. Because yes, you are free. All of these laws that were passed have been removed from the books, but yet you still cannot go forward into business because you have to work for free for another 8 years. On the island, there were 81,150 enslaved Africans. There were 81,000 enslaved Africans in Barbados. And 98% of them were born in Barbados. And that is important in the context because only 2% of the black people on this island at emancipation were born in Africa. It was the lowest percentage in the entire Caribbean. 30% of the enslaved Africans in Jamaica at the same date were born in Africa. So we have a largely Barbadian community. English-speaking, English acculturated to a large extent, ready to engage in commerce, but cannot. The Barbados slave owners received 1.7 million. And they got their 1.7 million in cash. Some of them got it in bonds that were floated on the British market. But the critical point about this 1.7 million pounds in 1834-36 was that it was a massive, enormous injection of finance capital into the white community. And if you look at what happened to this finance, it was an enormous stimulus package. In fact, if you take the British 20 million injected into the white community of the Caribbean, it was, in contemporary money, it is 3 times larger than Obama's stimulus packages. So if you take the Obama stimulus to the Wall Street banks, and you take the 20 million that was allocated to the Caribbean slave owners, it was 3 times larger. So this massive stimulus was then used to pay off debt. All the white plantations paid off their debts. They were able to modernize. They were able to expand. They were able to import the new technology. So it placed the white community at a new competitive advantage now to go forward to own the resources of Barbados more comprehensively. And this was clearly the intention of the Emancipation Act, to refinance the white community and send them into the future of freedom as monopoly owners of the wealth of these islands. This is very important, I believe, in understanding how all of this has happened. You may very well take a comparison. Let's take a comparison. Take Henry Lascelles, the second Earl of Hereford, the largest slave owner in Barbados and the second largest slave owner in Jamaica. Up comes emancipation. He cannot get the Jamaican blacks to work for him. Emancipation has come, we're done with you and that. The black people refused to work for Lord Hereford. He sent out attorneys, he sent out missionaries, sent all kinds of people from England to his plantations. And the message went back to Lord Hereford, tell the good Lord that we're not working for him. That was the message that went back to England. But in Barbados, all the blacks in Barbados at the Bell plantation, at the Thicket plantation, at all the plantations they owned, the blacks went back to work and worked even harder. Eventually what happened was the good Lord Hereford sold out all his Jamaican plantations, took the money from Jamaica and reinvested it in Barbados to expand his operations. And he wrote a very important letter in which he says, my family started in Barbados in 1640. This is now 1840, and I have come back from whence we have started. So that gives you a comparative reference to understand the context, but we do not blame the victim. The black folks in Barbados had nowhere to go. They had no land to occupy, they had no mountains to run to, they had no hills to go. They had to go back to work. They had to go back to work for the people who had enslaved them, and there was no room for entrepreneurship. There was no room for business. There was no room for that culture. Now the people are free to ignite their commercial life. There was no space. There was no room. Barbados was unique, the most oppressive society in the world. But let us look at how this pans out in terms of economic life. In every colony in the Caribbean, sugar production collapsed after emancipation because the blacks are withdrawing their labor and demanding better wages. They're demanding the right to own land. They withdrew their labor and their enthusiasm. In Jamaica, sugar production collapsed by 20%. In British Guyana, by 15%. In St. Lucia, by 12%. In every country, sugar production collapsed. In Barbados, sugar production increased by 24% after emancipation because the structure of the economy, the structure of the imprisonment of the people on the plantations, lack of choice, the criminalization of their economic culture, reduced to labor and nothing but labor. Let's look at the numbers. 1840, there are 298 effectively operational plantations in Barbados. 298 functioning plantations in Barbados. One is owned by a black person. One. Ellis Castle. Fast forward 60 years to 1900. Fast forward 60 years of freedom to the beginning of the 20th century. We have a massive increase of black ownership of plantations. It increased from 1 to 2. But statistically, that's what, 100%? Right. So now 1900, 2 plantations on this island. This is 3 generations of freedom, 2 plantations. The white community controls the land, all that is on it. The economy is structured and designed. I give you the historical background to let you understand that governments and all the politicians who are in this room, all the persons who have served in our assembly, must take ownership of this history. Because when you enter that parliament, you're entering into a place that has framed the world that continues to imprison us. So the norm at emancipation and thereafter within the black community is poverty and famine. Not surprisingly, Barbados is the only society in the Caribbean that has been classified as a society where the majority of the people are experiencing famine. Now, I want to speak about this. This is not poverty, this is famine. Famine is when people are dying from hunger. So Barbados in the 19th century is the only society where people are dying of famine. The British government, of course, is very concerned about this, and so the British government sends a royal commission down to Barbados in 1897 to examine and to report upon the causes of famine on this island. Now, there are some very interesting descriptions of this famine. One of my graduate students, Dr. Henderson Carter, wrote a very good dissertation on famine and food riots in Barbados in the 19th century, and describes in detail in his analysis the extreme measures that the people on this island had to go through to live. Some creative strategies like catching rats and eating rats. Now, it was very interesting how you would do that. The men would go into the cane fields and rattle the canes. The women would stand at the end of the cane row with crocus bags. And as the rats run through the cane lines and they come to the end, they would jump into the bag, and the women would catch the rats in the bag in order to live, in order to survive. So rat catching, rat eating, these were technologies. And the reason why this is happening is because of the issue of landlessness. Now, the 1897 Royal Report sent back its recommendation to England. It gave two explanations. That Barbados is the only society in the Caribbean where the majority of people are kept in a state of landlessness. Two, it is the only colony in the Caribbean where the black community does not participate in the economy. And because of these two features of economic life and ownership, the society at a difficult time experiences famine. The Royal Commission called for an end to black exclusion from the economy. The recommendations were very specific, very clear. It said there must be land reform. There must be incentives given to create black businesses. This was a Royal Commission, 1897. The report was ignored. Now, but this was a time when black folks in Barbados are rushing to Panama to make a living. 45,000 Barbadians, half of the labor force. It's difficult to imagine half of the people on the island disappearing. 45,000, 50% of the laborers on this island went off to Panama. And there were some interesting calypsos for those of you who have an interest in the performing arts. Interesting calypsos written by black folks at that time. Hit the plantation owner on his head and get on the boat to Panama. In other words, don't just go. Before you go, do something. Give the overseer a lash and then run down to Bridgetown and get on the boat. But don't just go. Take out your frustration, hit somebody on the head, and then you go to Panama. And those calypsos were popular. Hit the man on the head and go on the boat. So 45,000 go. They're making money. And they are coming back to Barbados, and for the first time in the history of this island, there is capital in the black community. The first time in the history on this island, there is cash capital circulating within the black community. In fact, what we can show is that over 20,000 black persons came back from Panama between 1906 and 1916, and these 20,000 returnees brought back between them 190,000 pounds. 190,000 pounds. They could buy half of the plantations in Barbados with that cash. Now, what's going to happen? What's going to happen now that the black community is riddled with cash in a structure that had excluded them for 200 years? Of course, the first thing they want to do is buy plantations. Not on. The government legislating, plantations shall not be sold. Social culture among the plantation owners, Plantations must not be sold to persons outside of the ethnic group. So tremendous frustration is building up in the country because the people have cash and they cannot buy into the system, because not only the institution and the role of the state, but it's also the ideology of exclusion. All of this cash is being soaked up by friendly societies. These are the forerunners of your credit unions. Friendly societies are popping up in every village because the black folks are putting their money in these friendly societies, hoping to leverage their assets for commercial purposes. The friendly societies were now getting ready to buy plantations on behalf of their members, to buy urban property on behalf of their members. But what happens? The government goes to work again. The government of Barbados goes to work again, and you only have to read the 1905 Friendly Society Act, legislated by the Barbados government. The 1905 Friendly Society Act makes it a criminal offense for any friendly society to buy or hold more than 1 acre of land. So no friendly society could buy or own or hold more than 1 acre of land. Now, the economy is now being tested. The government, of course, there are a few black folks in the government. Majority are members of the white community. The wings of the friendly societies are clipped. And they are clipped structurally and permanently. And we're speaking about hundreds of these friendly societies that are operating in Barbados. But then the second strategy came. What if we can soak up that capital from the black community and transfer it over to the other side? What if? That was the second strategy. Subdivide all of the RAB land, cut off the RAB land from the plantations, and since the blacks are property hungry and they have the cash, sell them the RAB land at premium prices. There's some interesting cases of this. I was quite impressed with the activities of Mr. Pilgrim. Mr. Pilgrim was the member of the Assembly for St. James. And he was the owner of estates in Sion Hill, Westmoreland, and Carlton. He cut off over 300 acres of his RAB land on his major estates and sold it to the black folks at phenomenal prices. You want it, you pay for it. All of that Panama money began to go back into the established structure, into the white community, and black folks ended up as owners of small pieces of RAB land. These strategies were supported and skillfully orchestrated by government. The Friendly Society Act was a masterful piece of economic exploitation of majority of people. And each time I listen to the conversation in Barbados about what the credit union movement should do and should be allowed to do and what they cannot do, it brings back the memory of 1905, the Friendly Society Act. The same mentality, the same attitude, how to clip the wings of the black community, mobilizing collectively its capital in order to go forward and participate. But while this is happening, while all of this is happening in the House of Assembly, the same House of Assembly is given approval for the consolidation of the plantation owners of Barbados to form conglomerates. And so in 1917, the leading plantation families in Barbados got together and formed Plantations Limited as a strategic response to the global challenges of the sugar industry. They legislated in order to survive, consolidated their positions in a commercial corporation. Following Plantations Limited, the merchants of Bridgetown also used their power over the legislation, or in the legislation, to do the same. So in 1920, the leading families in Bridgetown, who had just clipped the wings of the friendly societies,
established Barbados Shipping and Trade. Barbados Shipping and Trade established in 1920, consolidating the capital of the large commercial families in order to establish the domination of the Barbados economy and to survive. The role of the government becomes very critical. And this goes on and on and on. So when Mr. Barrow invited me, because he needed new language, and I said, well, the new language is economic enfranchisement that we have been pursuing for 200 years. It was the only language. It found its way into the manifesto, and it got no further. But let us speak of the Barbados model then, in which small businesses are marginalized, black business have no political protection in the parliament, the legislature gives them lip service. And despite all of the arguments as to why we need a revolution in thinking about small businesses and how to build out the thickness of the Barbados economy, and despite all of the leakages of big businesses in Barbados, we do not get policy action. Because we cannot get policy action because Barbados, our home, our society, is a society that is gridlocked. And it is gridlocked. Our home, in terms of social policy, is gridlocked. We have two black political parties that are dependent on white business to survive. We have two political parties that are dependent for their sustainability upon the system that has held the majority excluded from the economy, gridlocked. Mr. Barrow considered all of this in the independence process. And I think quite wisely, the choice before him, and he knew this history quite well, he knew all of this. Do we do a land reform? Should we take these large plantations and subdivide them and spread the land across? The choice which the government took was not to participate in the process of the acquisition of private property as was done in Zimbabwe. The government decided not to go that path, but instead to develop a fiscal policy whereby the owners of the land, the monopoly owners of the land, the monopoly owners of the corporate sector and the commercial sectors in Bridgetown, fiscal strategies were developed to extract taxation revenue from this community to transfer those revenues over to the black community for education and public health. And with time, through education and improved health and improved self-esteem, the black community will develop a professional class, and that professional class will transition into business and build a vibrant commercial culture on the island. It would take 2 generations to achieve, and that was the vision. In that way, the white community could maintain control of their property, but the economy would grow, and there would be room for everyone. There will be room for the white members of the society and room for the black members of the society. And over time, it will balance out and we will have an economic democracy in which all citizens could participate. That was the vision. Did not quite work like that. But now, the one plank that was laid out, which was access to higher education, to produce that professional class, to transition into commercial life, to build an entrepreneurial class in the black community, that plank has now been weakened. The question therefore is, with the weakening of this plank, what is likely to happen? And where have we reached? I will come to the end by making this statement. At the moment, our society is a frustrated society. I mentioned it is gridlocked, but it's also frustrated. Because we all know we cannot go on like this. But at the same time, there seems to be no political will to formulate a policy of inclusion of the majority of citizens into the economic life of the country. I have shared with you the historical background, how this economy was created. I have given you the historical data to demonstrate that it was structured like this by government. And the fact is, maybe it can only be unstructured by government. It was created this way historically. The black community has had 250 years of suffering in their efforts to participate in this economy. And now we have a small business association at the end of this history that is carrying the flag for the majority of the people. It is a very difficult moment for us. The country cannot continue like this. We need leadership in terms of economic structures and distribution. We need a new policy to formulate what citizenship is all about. And citizenship is not about exclusion from the economy. If you have a political democracy, you ought to have the right to participate in your economy equally and freely as a citizen. I thank the SBA for inviting me here this evening to identify with the achievements of Mr. Leacock, who we celebrate as an icon of this history. As always in history, you cannot hold everyone down. Some people will always break through because the creative genius exists in all people. And he was a creative genius and he survived. He showed us the way, and we are quite right, I believe, in celebrating his achievement as a light for our people. I thank you all very much for the generosity of your time.